It's a privilege to introduce Brenda Bradall to you. She's a supper club enthusiast. If I stopped right there, we'd actually all be experts. But I'm not going to stop there because she's gone beyond what the rest of us do, which is to eat in supper clubs. She's actually written a book about supper clubs. Supper Club State, a brief cultural history of the Wisconsin institution. We are pleased to have Brenda with us today. We're really happy. I wasn't at the first program you gave for us, but she gave a program, I think it was in Rhinelander, was it, a while ago, and great reports about that. So we're pleased to have you to share histories of the supper clubs of Wisconsin, some of the stories about supper clubs throughout Wisconsin and Minnesota. So welcome, Brenda. Thank you for being here. And as you're coming up, let me thank the owners again. Where are you? Both Greg and Molly in the back here, well, wherever you are. Thanks. This is fantastic. Great place. With a heavy volunteer participation, I learned, in the bottling and labeling, with a 47-year-old label machine. I didn't get the tour when you were on it, but I got it earlier. It's pretty interesting. So anyway, here you are, Brenda.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellsworth. Well, we hope the technical difficulties don't come through. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome, and this is actually the third time that I've given this for the Wisconsin Historical Society. The first time at the museum in Madison, it was a little bit different but somewhat similar, so let's hope the third time's a charm. Thank Greg and Molly. I'm so glad to see this renaissance of brewing and distilling in our state with the 80th anniversary repeal. I think it's a really vibrant, interesting business in which we all enjoy in moderation. And thanks to RJ's for catering our event. We're a little bit German beer garden here today, but that's good. We'll talk supper clubs as we go. And I want to thank our panelists, John and Wayne Warling. They're going to talk a little bit afterwards. We're going to share a little bit of their story. John's grandfather, Wayne's dad, Vern Warling, founded the Country House up the road here, and that was quite a storied supper club in its day. It's no longer there, but the Valley House is in its place, so make sure you stop up there. We're going to just explore what a supper club is. There's somebody from California here that said, I have no idea. We'll explore why we know what a supper club is in the upper Midwest and why they survived in Wisconsin. And then we'll just tour the St. Croix Valley and learn some of the stories and look at works of two mid-century restaurant architects. So one question I always get, now here's where the technical difficulty might come in. Didn't, good, is why, Brenda, why are you so interested in supper clubs? Well, my family history is part of that. My parents owned a bar in Chippewa Falls in the late 40s and 50s, and they had great stories about dining and dancing. They met at Proch's Ballroom in Ellsworth, and my grandparents in the 30s and 40s worked at the Buckhorn, one of the supper clubs we're going to visit today. So, and also my cousin Bonnie, who couldn't be here today, ran her family's Enterprise Lurks Bar in Afton. Some of you may know that name. And she retired a few years back. The bar is still there. She hasn't decided what yet to do with it. So, ooh, a little bit of the Irish. Okay. One of the other reasons that I got quite interested in supper clubs was that I got a scholarship from the Hudson Star Observer in college, and when my mom and I took out Willis Miller, who many of you know that name, he's kind of legendary in these parts, when we took him out to the River's Edge in Somerset to thank him, and those two went on and on and on about the 30s, 40s, and 50s and the heyday of the supper clubs in this area and other parts of the state. So that really resulted in my interest, and numerous articles and publications from the Chicago Tribune to this historical piece in the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters magazine. So let's get to the question at hand, what is a supper club? Milwaukee native Lawrence Frank started the first supper club in the 1920s in Beverly Hills, according to the Wisconsin Historical Society. That became the famous Lowry's Prime Rib on Restaurant Row there. And yes, Lawrence Frank was head of Lowry's Seasoning Salt. He was quite the entrepreneur and foodie and inventor. Susan Wagoner, author of Nightclub Nights, writes that the pairing of dining with entertainment was invented to circumvent prohibition. The urban nightclub was born as a place to eat, be entertained, and enjoy soft drinks. That fiction was clung to with zeal, she writes, as dining and dancing were covers for getting the real McCoy. Out in the rural areas, like Wisconsin, you had the country cousin to the nightclub, which was in the roadhouses, dance halls, and small ballrooms. After repeal, liquor licenses were easily granted to those establishments that served food. The supper club concept flourished with auto tourism as well. So you had a lot of mid-century continental style restaurants that emerged all over the country, bringing a theater of food with flamin' desserts, salads prepared tableside, and exotic menu items alongside the more American surf and turf. Here in the upper Midwest, and especially Wisconsin, we had a great woods and water culture. The restaurants here fared better than their counterparts in the cities and on the coasts during urban renewal. In Wisconsin, the ample vacation land and quite possibly our less blue attitude toward alcohol helped those supper clubs get started and survive. Often family-run, supper clubs survived the off-season as a community place for proms and anniversaries, Rotary meetings, and political rallies, providing a setting that was a little bit more lively than the church basement. So we need a little Packer Viking drama here on the border, right? When we talk about Prohibition, we'll put it in. Well known is the name Andrew Volstead, a senator from Minnesota who introduced Prohibition. Less well known, and now I'm going to boast a little as a Packer fan, is the name John Blaine, who was a senator from Wisconsin. He later became governor, and he introduced repeal. Yes, that's applause-worthy. Wisconsin had already left enforcement up to the feds, however, with the 1927 Severson Act. They basically said, we're not enforcing the law, it's too hard. When a federal agent came up to survey the state, he found a, quote, Gibraltar of the Wets where everyone drank their fill openly. Now I'm preaching to the choir here. The St. Croix Riverway has long attracted visitors for its beauty. Its watersheds supplied a regional demand for wild Wisconsin frog legs way back then that appeared on supper club menus from Chicago and Minneapolis to Milwaukee and St. Paul from the 1930s on. Here on the border, a Minnesota blue law that lasted from 1933 to 1968 prohibited the on-site Sunday liquor service in restaurants in Minnesota. So this created a 35-year opportunity in Wisconsin that had a great impact on our supper clubs, especially along the border. Supper clubs are a hot topic today, with a lot of us getting older and looking back at our roots. 2 tour books came out this year, one on Midwestern supper clubs, one on some in Wisconsin, and there's a short program on public television you may have seen by a filmmaker. Websites and print feature lists of favorites, and the Wisconsin Supper Club even made the New York Times travel section this year. There's some cards on your table, and they promote a forthcoming feature-length film by Holly DeReuter. She's filmed this presentation, and I'm served as a source in her film, and she's also filmed at some of the spots that we're going to visit today. So take a look at that and take that with you. I think all of this historical and contemporary interest really helps the industry. And although Jake's in Menominee and parishes in St. Paul closed in recent years, new owners have purchased them and kept the supper club vibe alive. We have new school supper clubs like the Old Fashioned in Madison and Jensen's and the Red Stag in the Twin Cities, and they're thriving with the formula. It's all good. But like everything, we have to take a little bad with the good. If you've never been to Turk's up in the upper St. Croix Riverway, you really missed out. Sadly, Marge Gogian died this year in February. Her father, George the Turk, founded the Supper Club, and that story is incredibly fascinating and is in Holly's documentary. With no heirs, Marge wished that Turks be sold and assets used for scholarships. And now to make a little shameless plug for preservation, wouldn't it make a great historic site? Turks had an air of immigrant authenticity, serving shish kebabs, rice pilaf, baklava, and Turkish coffee, alongside steaks and seafood. Curiosities adorned every corner. Outside there were exotic birds and a gardens leading down to the Namakagon. In fact, if you've ever floated down the Namakagon, you round the bend and you see the hardscapes that lead up to the siren red canopy in the back of Turks. It's pretty cool. This is a really fine example of programmatic architecture, or similar to what we think of now as the theme restaurant. These supper clubs in the mid-century often employed such themes: nautical, exotic, woodsy, colonial, futuristic, all meant to signify that the special experience you'd have inside. Now this one hits close to home. The Smith family in Hudson sold the sports club that they established in 1957. And Holly came up this year to interview some of the locals and to do some filming. And some of those locals that are on the film are here. Judy and Bill right over there. Raise your hands. She also interviewed, there's Judy and Bill right there. She also interviewed sisters Sherry and Julie Horn that I went to school with, whose father at one time owned the JR Ranch. And that's a story for another time, but it was a very famous supper club that brought a national rodeo to the region. And that's all I'm going to say about it. It's got its own PowerPoint. So let's go back now to the lower St. Croix Riverway in St. Croix Falls and start here. This one's for sale. The Windjammer is another really great example of that roadside programmatic architecture. Does anybody want to guess what kind of food was served here? Nearby on the Apple River was one of the most notorious supper clubs in western Wisconsin, the Country Dam. This Wild West club was owned by Jim and Lola Woodley. The Woodleys offered the classic trio of dining, dancing, and drinking, plus a paddle boat rental and a cheese shop. Many bands performed there: the Trashmen, the Rivingtons, Mike Wagoner and the Bops, Larry Lee Phillipson, a Rockabilly Hall of Famer from Milwaukee. In 1966, the Country Dam financed a band's first 45 in the hopes they would make it big. According to the website, GarageHangover.com, the band Men at Work only saw 100 copies, while 900 were supposedly pressed for distribution, and they went missing. Maybe it was the ghosts. Let's consult the website Unexplained Research on the Country Dam. And I've heard this story. I know somebody that used to cook there, and you may have heard some of the stories too about some of the ghost stories associated with this restaurant. A popular restaurant and saloon rumored to have been owned by a member of the mafia. Murder victims were buried in the basement under cement floors. One day, the owner locked up the doors and walked away, never to be seen again. The ghosts of those who were murdered remained behind and still haunt the building. I took these photos in 1987 after it closed. Jim and Lola both died in 1995, and Jim Woodley was seen around after the restaurant closed. In 2003, the buildings were burned down by the fire department when they restored the natural riverway and the dam was removed. The Steamboat Round the Bend Supper Club was built in St. Croix Falls at Highways 35 and 8 in 1939. Owner James Miller closed it temporarily while he went off to fight in World War II. A fire in 1965 led to a remodel to its current exterior by architect Al Svensson. Jim Miller Jr., who was hoping to be here today and talk with us a little bit, has lots of great stories, and there's some beautiful architectural features that are very indicative of mid-century supper clubs. So if you get a chance, go up there. In 2005, Jim Miller Jr. sold it to the current owner, Steve Bailey, and he was hoping to come today too, but couldn't make it. And they have really kept it true to that supper club tradition with dining, dancing, and drinking. My husband and I have seen Wayne the Train Hancock there. He's a national recording artist from Austin. We've seen local bands. It's just a great little spot, and I encourage you to visit it if you haven't. Architect Al Svensson was a very eccentric and artistic fellow who lived in St. Croix Falls and Golden Valley. He designed many beautiful homes on the St. Croix Bluff and several mid-century supper clubs in the Twin Cities, including the famous Diamond Jim's Supper Club in Mendota. This supper club was known for its swinging ladies, swinging from the ceiling. And if you go to the Juke Joint Comedy Club or Moose Country in Mendota, you'll still see much of the architectural remnants of this kind of eclectic Old West theme that this whole strip was built in, that Al Swenson designed. His other supper clubs include McGuire's in Arden Hills, which is gone, the Golden Steer, gone, Michael's, I think gone, Shakopee House, I think it's gone, and the London House in Duluth, which is gone. My favorite of Al's work, however, is the Lilydale Pool and Yacht Club. It's just gorgeous. It's on the Mississippi in Mendota, and of course he designed it as a riverboat. It's just cool. So check it out. It is a private club, but they will let you in if you show some architectural or historic interest. Or you know somebody. On the Ample River near Somerset is the river's edge, which started as a roadhouse in 1920 called the Chicken Shack. Somerset has a very colorful history, as many of you probably know, associated with French immigrants and moonshining, but that again is a whole nother story for another day. In 1931, it became the Riverdale nightclub with food and dancing, and I'm guessing some of the very famous Somerset Moon. Jack and Alice Raleigh took over in 1946 after Jack reportedly won the nightclub in a card game. It achieved fame when journalist Charles Kuralt wrote about its frog leg dinners and river tubing in the 60s and 70s. And in fact, he became a very close friend of the Raleighs and had his retirement party from CBS News there. John Raleigh's here with Willis Miller, and this was taken in 2007 when I was up visiting with the two of them. And John and his siblings, I think his sisters, still run the supper club today. I think he's had a couple of siblings that passed this year. And I did invite him to be with us today, but he couldn't make it. They run the supper club seasonally. It's worth a trip. The inside is fabulous. It's kind of untouched. You see this kind of 1930s mural in the background of the fish in the piano room. It's a fabulous enterprise. But they run it seasonally as a concert venue, supper club, campground, and tubing enterprise. Gus Biles started the Somerset Frog Leg Company in 1920. So I'm thinking that the Chicken Shack was the first to have served frog legs in the area. We have the Palms in Somerset, the Bygone Palms claiming that, but I'm going to guess that the Chicken Shack may have been the first. Frogs were very abundant in our region's watershed at one time. The process of catching them was called gigging, where you used a three-pronged spear to catch them in the fields after the wheat was harvested. Independent hunters caught them for Biles and another facility in nearby Holton owned by Joe Shettle. And I interviewed Joe Shettle extensively in the early 90s and did an article just on the Western Wisconsin frog legacy. That's not a pun. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, Somerset also had the Terrace, the Steakhouse, and the Palm Supper Clubs serving the famous Wisconsin frog legs. In 1956, Centennial History of the Village of Somerset, Father John Rivard wrote about Somerset as the frog leg capital of the world. This 1937 article appearing in the Miami News details Biles' operation. They processed up to 900 saddles a day for supper clubs, keeping frogs in holding ponds in a shed just below freezing, so they were suspended in hibernation. Otherwise, everyone's done eating, right? They were a bit cannibalistic. Frogs can't be in captivity together. You can't raise them in aquaculture. Just to add a detail. Outside was a large holding pond for the turtles that they kept also for food and biological operations as well. Biles sold the operation to Earl Hecht, and when it closed in the 1970s, Rand McNally leased the facility, packaging frogs for labs until the harvest ran even lower. Those days now, the Wisconsin frog legs are long over. This is now a private garage, and I was lucky enough to get a tour by the owner of it last year. There's a 1959 poem, Ode to Wisconsin, that talks about the frog farms of Somerset. That was quite interesting to find that. Now here we are down at the hilltop, closer to Hudson, in Holton, Wisconsin. This is right across from Stillwater, Minnesota. At one time, there was a bowling alley, drive-in theater, a liquor store, a couple of taverns, several supper clubs, and a motel. Henny's Hilltop was a roadhouse built about 1930, and about 1937, Phil Henny turned it into a supper club. Great-granddaughter Kim Henny Kalashinsky said that reservations were made many months in advance for its annual Lebanese food festival, where Phil's mother cooked traditional food. Phil ran it until his death in 1977, when it was sold and became the Highlander Supper Club. And we can talk a little bit about that with John and Wayne, as Wayne's brother Keith bought the Highlander. Now it's a strip joint called the Cajun. Next door to Holcomb's, built in 1955, was next door to the Henny's was Holcomb's, built in 1955 by George and Gladys Holcomb. But I'm going to rewind a little bit and go down to their first supper club on Highway 35 called the Buckhorn. In the 1930s, the Holcombs ran the Buckhorn Inn. It was rebuilt after a fire in 1937 and operated until 1961, when it burned down again. With the Minnesota law prohibiting Sunday on-site liquor, the Buckhorn did a swinging business on Sundays and was well known for its frog leg dinners. The 15-foot neon letterboard signaled all the fun to be had over on the Wisconsin side. For example, in 1942, the newspapers reported that the Buckhorn was robbed by hoodlums from St. Paul, and again in 1951 by masked bandits who held the patrons and employees at gunpoint. That's kind of some wild fun. Here's some pictures of the sign in recent years. And I'll make another shameless plug for preservation here too. Although the new Stillwater crossing is no longer planned at this property, apparently the Buckhorn sign still must come down with the building of the new bridge. And I think it would be really great to preserve this sign or a few letters and install them on the public bike trail that's supposed to go in between the new bridge and the old bridge, and have some interpretive signage detailing this vibrant history of the Hilltop Supper Clubs. Okay, I got lost with that plug. George Holcomb met Vern Warling, who bartended at the Parker House, a supper club on the Mississippi in Mendota. When a liquor license in St. Croix County was available, George Holcomb told Vern he should start a restaurant over here. And Vern took George's advice, and he decided to build a supper club across from the Buckhorn. It was on the site of the current Valley House, which was built in the 70s and is now owned by Sheena and Jerry Peterson and Paul Belisle. And Sheena had hoped to be here too, but she had another event going on. So if you haven't been up there, be sure to stop into the Valley House and see their great little historical display of all the Hilltop Supper Clubs. Here's a picture of Sheena and John Warling looking at the original plans, architectural plans for the country house. Vern had hired noted Twin Cities designer Werner Wittkamp to design his country house, which opened in 1955 with a lot of fanfare. It had the new open-view charbroiler, and John and Wayne have many interesting stories about the restaurant, but I'll just summarize and say that success was not all that rosy for Vern. Up until about 1968, when the liquor law changed, business boomed and it was the hottest spot around. But that all changed when the law changed. When a deal fell through to sell the country house, it burned to the ground in 1974. Vern had let the insurance policy lapse, and he was really quite happy to walk away. In later years, Vern warned John about the nearly 24/7 nature of the business and the many, many temptations that you'd be faced with. Holcomb's operated, this was up by Henny's, operated from 55 to 79 when it burned as well. And I found some evidence that Werner Wittkamp may have done a remodel of Holcomb's at some time, but I still have to check that out. Hudson Star-Observer editor Doug Stolberg once wrote in his column right before New Year's Eve that 11 supper clubs in the valley, of those 11, all but 2 burned to the ground. He didn't make any assumptions, but he just put the facts out there. I remember going to Holcomb's many times as a youngster, and it was a real fancy place with a piano bar, linen, the waterfall, the pond, the garden, and all that remains now is a few hardscapes and an overgrown empty lot. Werner Wittkamp was a Hollywood set designer who had worked with the Ziegfeld Follies and on several films in the 1920s. He was affiliated with the Bilesby Engineering and Meeting Corporation. He moved to St. Paul in 1930 to design the Cinderella Cosmetics Factory, which opened to much theatrical fanfare, including a Hollywood starlet. It closed a year later, as it turned out to be a front for a bootlegging operation. Wittkamp, however, found other work, redesigning hotel bars and restaurants in the Twin Cities, as well as his work building the country house from the ground up. His most famous work is the Lexington in St. Paul, which recently closed and is for sale, in case anybody is looking. Wittkamp's other notable work includes the townhouse on University Avenue in St. Paul and its neighbor, the bygone Criterion, which was a very, very fancy supper club in St. Paul, very well known. Wittkamp was also the interior designer of record over the years for the Lexington, doing many remodels on the inside, and the Wilwerscheid on Grand Avenue and many other funeral homes. And several of these still exist. The Commodore Hotel Bar is there. I heard it's nearly intact, although it's an apartment building or a condominium. The Curtis is gone. I don't know about the other funeral homes. The Wilwerscheid is there. Criterion's gone, but there's a few places you could see Werner's work yet today. Well, let's return to Wisconsin now for two final supper clubs down near Prescott. The Virginian on US 10 opened on New Year's Eve in 1957. It was very much like the country house in that it had the open charcoal grill where you could watch your food being prepared. Virginia and Vernon Johnson sold it on contract 3 times, always getting it back, according to their grandson. In 1970, though, the third time was a charm, and they sold it to Tom and Beverly Rubel, and over the years they were frequent customers for all their family occasions and holidays. In 2006, the Rubels sold it, and it operated briefly as a sports bar but closed. It's great now that it's reopened by a local woman as an event center, the Hilltop Event Center, and she's built a beautiful open-air pavilion out back, so it looks like it's going to be a fantastic site for weddings and other parties. The former Steamboat Inn in Prescott was built in the early 60s at the confluence of the St. Croix and Mississippi, and like others now up for sale, it's up for sale as the Vista Croix development. And I'm really guessing that if these two were in urban areas, we'd no longer see them. So it's kind of cool that they still remain and that they can be reused for other purposes. Well, that concludes our tour today of St. Croix Valley Supper Clubs. And since you've been so attentive and laughed at all the right places, I have a little treat for you. If my Halloween candy friends will help me. Pam. This is something that you'd get at every supper club in the St. Croix Valley back in the day when I was growing up. A Pearson's Mint Patty. Thank you. Oh, we got loads of time. Okay.
Yes. You can announce.
Oh, okay. All right.
You pull.
Chepo?
Pull. Your bride.
Yeah, this is an awesome book. Okay. Drum roll, Jackie Corrigan from Baldwin, Wisconsin. Oops. Ooh, that is awesome. Yeah, well, yeah, we've got plenty of time. It's great, yeah. Do we have any questions?
How about an answer?
Pardon me?
How about an answer?
Sure.
We're neighbors of the Lexington.
Oh.
And we have heard that's been sold, and we have seen some signs of people around that are working on the place. They've been through 3 owners in the last maybe 7 or 8 years, and they've had a terrible time keeping the place open in the summers. But I know that I've seen workmen in the place working on it, and in theory they're supposed to be reopening here in the not too distant future. So
That's awesome. Yeah, I read it was sold once and then the deal fell through and it was up for sale again, was the last I read in the Business Journal.
that could well be, but again, we have seen recent evidence of workmen, so that's the only thing I know, but I thought that it was.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, let's talk to John and Wayne Warling a little bit. They have quite a history, a family history in the restaurant business with the Blue Horse, the Anchor Inn, the Highlander, the Country House. Is that it? One Potato Two chain. Yes. Yeah, so John, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of your stories when you were little in the Country House?
Well, I was obviously pretty young at the time, but I remember there was a bottle chute, a beer bottle chute, that the beer bottles you'd put in behind the bar, and they'd go downstairs and collect. And I used to put the bottles in and try to run down and beat them, you know, to the downstairs. I never beat them. And there was an open pit incinerator, and you'd talk about insurance issues, but you would walk in to a room and there's an open pit, and you'd throw the boxes and whatever else, you know, you were getting rid of, and God knows what you were getting rid of back then. But I used to have nightmares about that as a kid, because he used to tell me, hey, we're going to throw you in there, you know. Yeah, you know, you got to do that to your kids. So, but one funny thing piece of advice my grandfather always gave me was, nothing will cause you more misery than what's in your pants. And that was kind of a summary of, you know, what could happen in the restaurant business.
Those temptations.
Yeah, those temptations.
Yeah.
But going back to the frog legs, this is a menu from the Country House. Some of you might have seen it, and this is from 1957. And that order of frog legs from that provider cost $3.75 for an order. Yeah, the shuttle frog legs. And I don't know if Dad wants to say anything. Yeah, but if you'd like to come up and talk to him, you know, he's got a lot of stories. And there's one other thing. If you look back at this cooler back here, that panel cooler, Nor Lake, some of you might have heard of them. They started out making these coolers, and the Country House was the first restaurant to have a Nor Lake cooler, because my grandfather knew someone who was trying to, you know, experiment with this new type of cooler. And there were 2 things that survived the fire: the cooler and everything in it, and the liquor room. And there's pictures of the fire here if you'd like to look at them, but the food was all usable the next day that was in the cooler after the fire, and it was a bad fire. So that's kind of interesting. And then Nor Lake took off from there, because they used a lot of these pictures in their advertising. So that's kind of neat.
Tell us about the handyman that worked for your grandpa.
Dad, I think that's where you're going to tell him. Yeah.
He had some good stuff.
Yeah. Here.
Well, you ask him about the handyman.
Yeah, I asked him about the handyman. He was pretty ingenious. I guess he ran a pipe. Before it was built, he ran a pipe, because there was no, the septic systems were,
non-existent.
Yeah, and to handle a restaurant like this in the middle of nowhere was, you know, it hadn't been really done before, and the volume that they had with the dish machines and the, you know, the toilets. And well, he ran a pipe underneath before they built it. He dug it in, and there's a sharp drop off to the south, and he ran a pipe out, and everything went out, and it never froze up in the wintertime, but that's where all the waste went. That pipe is still there, coming out somewhere. So, you know, you had to do what you had to do. Yeah. So that was pretty interesting, and
yeah. Why don't you tell us which family members own which restaurants, and maybe talk a little bit about the Blue Horse.
Oh,
people know of that place.
Yeah, my grandfather, he was doing real well at the country house, and his brother came back, Cliff, from Seattle after the World's Fair in Seattle, and the hotel he was involved in, the Sorrento, went bankrupt. And so my grandfather, you know, being loyal to his brother, put him up in the Blue Horse. And the Blue Horse was formerly Napoleon's, across the street from Montgomery Ward's, which is no longer there, which seems to be the theme today. No longer there. But so he put him in there and set him up, you know, bought the building, paid for the help, you know, the redesign, everything, and pretty much, you know, mortgaged out the whole country house for his brother. And the Blue Horse was very successful till, what, 91, 92?
30 years.
Yeah, 30 years. A great restaurant, you know, if you've ever been in there.
The designer they brought in,
Yeah, who is it?
the one who built, Voluntary built this.
Oh, the designer that he brought in to redesign the inside was the same one who designed the Space Needle at the State Fair. Or no, was it?
Seattle.
Oh, in Seattle, the Seattle tower that you all see. So, you know, he seemed to come up with people, and yeah, the Blue Horse pretty much died off because the customers died off. The legislators couldn't come down and get drunk for lunch anymore, and what was it? Brown and Bigelow.
Brown and
Bigelow was there. They went they left, and you know, and then you know the advent of sports bars, and you know people just didn't come in and eat. That food would kill you, I'll tell you. You know, when you're talking about you know, fettuccine Alfredo, you know, which was really good, and you know. It's, you know, if you want to look at the menus, there's a menu from '62 when it opened here, and I think that's a lunch menu. But you'll really laugh at the prices, you know. And it was good quality stuff, not something you get off an order guide today, you know, at one of these, you know, sports bars, or you know, so.
And they were quite the vintners. Look at this wine selection for '62. I mean, this is really somebody with knowledge. Yeah,
that was Cliff's thing. Cliff really liked that, you know, the high class stuff, and you know, where Grandpa was more into the, you know, the meat and potatoes. Well, here, look at the two menus. Hold that one up. Mm-hmm. Here you go. Country House,
City House,
Blue Horse. You know. That's why he couldn't keep a chef.
Yeah. Calf liver sauté lyonnaise. Sweetbreads financier. Those are.
Yeah.
What kind of brains are they? Calf brains.
Yeah, they're like the
thymus. Okay. Oh, so TMI.
Yeah, but then you know my dad's brother, he owned the Highlander, and then my uncle from my mom's side, who worked at. He worked at the country house as a kid during high school. Yeah, and he got involved in. He was part owner of the Anchor Inn. He started One Potato Two. He owned a restaurant called Pauline's, and several other things he was into. But after 3 wives, and you know, the restaurant business is not family friendly. And now he's he's one of the guys who runs Maplewood Toyota. So that's what he does today. He's been working in the car business for the last 20 years, and is happily married and couldn't be happier, and doesn't even want to talk about the restaurant business. You know, But, you know, I mean, there's a lot of great stories, and, you know, it's pretty neat to be a part of this, and it's pretty neat that Brenda has taken an interest in this stuff, and, you know, the history is great.
Well, thank you, John, and thanks, Wayne, for coming today. I invite you guys to come up and talk to John and Wayne and look at the menus and share your memories of eating at some of these places. We tried to pick just the Twin Cities ones, but Wayne's probably got one from wherever you're from in that box. So thank you so much. Yeah.